Our seventh study in this section of the book of Acts covers chapters 24, verse 1 through chapters 26, verse 32. This really covers the time period when Paul is in prison at Caesarea, that major Roman city that Herod had built. We find that, first of all, as we see him there, he has been charged. He is charged before a man named Felix, who is the governor at that time, sort of in the same role that Pontius Pilate would have had. And you might have caught some of the parallels with the trial of Jesus and the trial of Paul. The trial of Jesus and the trial of Peter and the trial of Paul and the trial of Stephen all have some kind of characteristics in common, where the religious leaders, except for the trial with Stephen and Peter, two of them, Paul particularly now is going to be before the Roman Empire. Peter never quite gets that far to be accused before the Romans, and Stephen, of course, is killed in kind of mob action. So really the closest parallel that we have to Jesus' condemnation is Paul. Here, the leaders are going to say there is no reason to accuse him or convict him or put him to death. Jesus was seen as much more of a problem because of his direct confrontation with the Pharisees and his long-standing time in the land of Israel and Judah. Here, because Paul was in Asia Minor and in Europe in general, there was not as much of a concern. The religious leaders had problems with him, but there was not a threat of a major riot taking place as they thought earlier. So as Paul is charged at Caesarea, he is accused by Ananias, who's serving as the high priest, and elders, and you'll note that a man named Tertullus comes as the spokesman. So they would have people that were particularly gifted in speaking and were able to lay these charges forth. Felix hears that that Paul is a Nazarene agitator. So we have this name Nazarene, connected probably because Jesus came from Nazareth. There is less support for the fact that he was a Nazarene because of having a Nazarite vow to refuse to cut his hair or to stay away from dead animals or stay away from any kind of alcohol. Some people think that that's where the Nazarene sect got its connection, but that doesn't seem to have much support. But because Paul is a follower of Jesus, this one who had kind of set the world upside down at just a few years earlier, now he is being accused. Here the main accusation is not only that he's following this Nazarene agitator, but also that he had profaned the temple. Remember the charges that he had brought a Gentile into the court of the Jews, which he denied. He had been with Gentiles, but he had not brought any of them into the temple court. As a Pharisee, he knew better than that, but accused nonetheless. Well, we have several replies here. This is really a fascinating section because we see Paul talking first of all to Felix, and then to Festus, and then to Bernice and Agrippa, the king and his bride, his queen. And so we have this background now of how does Paul get characterized as having defended himself. There are some who look at these as direct word-for-word narrations. Others would say that they are in substance reconstructions of the main arguments that Paul would have made. It's very difficult to know now exactly how all of that would have taken place, and as Paul is being represented here, certainly this is the essence of the argument that he had made. Whether Luke is right there or whether Paul sort of characterizes that later to say, here's what I had to say, it is the substance of how he would have argued. As Paul then stands and gives his reply, he says, I'm glad to give a cheerful defense for all of what I'm being accused of, and goes immediately to the central point that he says, I'm here because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. So he brings up this charge once again that he had used when he brought the Pharisees and the Sadducees against one another, that the resurrection was the chief event, that there was a future life, both for those who are at peace with God and those against him, and Jesus Christ is the one who brings that resurrection into existence by his own death and resurrection. So Paul says, when I was in the temple of Jerusalem, I was only there bringing alms for the poor people. I was not doing anything that was illegitimate. And the ones who really have had trouble with me are the Jews who knew me from Asia. They're the ones who kept on going from town to town. And we might remember that there are Jewish people even into Greece who pursue him from one town to another as he is making his way through Macedonia. And Paul says, these people here, they have simply been told by others that I'm a troublemaker. The actual accusers ought to be here to tell you about what I've done wrong. So the response then in chapter 24, verses 22 to 29, then is going to be a response from Felix, who says, I'll wait until Lysias the tribune, some sort of a judge official, until he comes, and he says, I'll just let you here for a while. Now, we're told that the real reason is he hoped that he could get a bribe, and the last 2 years of his reign, he's waiting maybe for somebody from Paul's group to give him enough money to say, I'll dismiss the charges. He and his wife Drusilla do hear about the faith from time to time, and Paul, as he gives his statements, says, I must take note of the fact that what we really have here are issues of justice and self-control, as well as issues of judgment. So he's looking for things where there should be a commonality with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire would want justice, and they would know that there is a judgment that at least comes before rulers, and also self-control. So he is saying this is not a movement to cause trouble. It was not many decades later that there were Jews who started the first Jewish revolt, ending in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. So when Paul kind of distances himself by saying this is a movement of self-control, and that he's not calling for trouble in the politically charged atmosphere that they had in that day, that would have been important. Well, chapter 25, verses 1 to 12, we find that because Paul had not found a way to pay some money, that when Felix is replaced by Festus as the next governor or procurator, that he also has left Paul in prison. And as Festus then gets to Jerusalem and begins to make his way to meet the new leaders, or meet the leaders as the new leader of the Roman Empire there, he is told once again about Paul. The Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, had not forgotten that they wanted to try to do him in. Their real plan was to have Festus bring Paul up to Jerusalem, and as they had tried a couple years before, to see if they could ambush him and kill him on the way. But the ruse is not accepted. Festus maybe even heard that there was a plan afoot at one time, which is why he was in Caesarea. And so he says, no, you can appear before me. If that's what you want to do, to accuse him, you come before me in Caesarea, and we'll take care of it then. Paul says in his defense to Festus, I am not going against the Jewish people. I haven't made any accusations or destruction threats against the temple. I've said nothing against Caesar. So basically says there are no charges that you can bring against me. But if I am to be charged, I want to talk to Caesar himself. I don't want to go before these Jewish leaders. They're only out to get me. If I've done anything that's a capital crime, let Caesar determine it. It won't be too many years later, in the early 60s, that tradition tells us that Paul was put to death at the time of Nero, but that's still a couple of decades away. So during this time period, then, the last half of chapter 25, we're told that the king, the Jewish king, Herod Agrippa, and his wife Bernice show up, and that Festus invites them to hear Paul. And so Festus explains a little bit about the background of why Paul is there, and then Paul goes on and says this is more than just a superstition. Festus had characterized it as that Paul was concerned with these superstitions about Jesus. Again, a little hint about how did the outsiders look at this Christian movement. Oh, they got these wild ideas that there was this fellow named Jesus who rose from the dead. And what does Paul do? But as he begins to make his defense, he says, well, indeed, this Jesus who died is alive. So with great pomp and circumstance, the tribunes and the leaders and the king and the queen come, and as they listen to Paul, they say there's nothing here to deserve death. Remember, that's what Pilate had said. There's nothing worthy of death. And yet at that time, because of the great threat of a riot in Jerusalem, there was finally determination that Jesus would be killed. Now, um, they say if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we'd have been able to let him go free, but since he appealed to Caesar now, we better write something down to say what this is all about. And then Paul makes his rather extended defense before Agrippa and Bernice. He says it's really good that I'm able to talk to you, and now we get into chapter 26, because he says, you know the Jews very well. Your family's been tied in with the Jewish people for a long, long time. You know the laws, you know the customs, and I myself was a very strict Pharisee. He says, I can talk a little bit more personally to you about the background now. He doesn't remind Festus or Felix before him that he had been a Pharisee, but he knows that Herod is going to know this party. So he says, I was a Pharisee. I was as strict as one could be, and I had hope that the promises that God had made to the fathers would be fulfilled, and that we were the ones who were to be as faithful as we could be, so those promises would come. So he lays out the case that he is not a rabble-rouser. The Pharisees actually got along quite well with both the Jewish king and with the political leaders. They knew that if they started revolts, that they were going to be crushed, but they were able to say, we will make sure people stay very strict to good citizenry, and thus they were not seen as the big enemy that the zealots who later start the revolt were later seen to be. But he says, I had this hope of that the promise that God had made to our fathers, that there would be a restoration of the kingdom, and he ties that in with resurrection here. He says, what's the big surprise? That God raises people from the dead. He promised us that we would have our land and our kingdom, and thus to believe that someone came forth from the grave is fulfilling what we've been waiting for all along. Why should we be surprised? Why shouldn't we be jumping up and down with joy? And so he says that as he was indeed in process of believing that, he had heard about Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, I voted that people who were following him should be put to death. That's kind of a shaky proposition here, because the Jews really weren't supposed to put anybody to death, but Paul says, I assented to those deaths as well. He says, I was looking for any way to punish people who followed this Jesus, to kind of push them into being blasphemers, and in fact, that if I could, I would put them in jail. I was even going into foreign countries to be able to do that. So Paul is trying to justify that there was nothing in his bones that led him to want to follow Jesus. But then he says, I was on the road to Damascus with letters to go and bring Christians back to Jerusalem. I might say here that there's also a question of what kind of legality there would have been for a Pharisee to go into another country and take people who are living in that land back to the land they came from. But anyway, he has letters to be able to pull that off. And he says, as I was on the way, this bright light shone at midday. And there were all sorts of people around me, and at midday, if there's going to be a bright light, it's really going to be something, because the sun is already shining. And he says he heard then from Jesus, who says, you having trouble kicking against the goads? You having trouble with things that are getting in your way? He says, I'm Jesus whom you are persecuting. That major event changed Paul's life completely. He gave up on any kind of salvation through the law. A lot of his followers and friends weren't quite so willing to give up on that, but he just completely did full circle and said, if Christ is the Savior, then everything we did in the meantime had no validity whatsoever. And so he says that Jesus told me to go and proclaim to people in the darkness that they should come into the light, and proclaim that the power of God was at work, and proclaim that the forgiveness of sins could lead people to be living holy lives. Thus, that the Jews who thought they were living righteous lives were really sinning and were really in darkness. He says, I was told, and I went and I preached that great news in Damascus already and Jerusalem, but then that the Lord delivered him from those things and said, you're going to go to the Gentiles. And he doesn't really go into much detail here about his various missionary journeys, but you can assume that some of that knowledge was there. And then he says that the Savior told him, Christ told him that he was going to suffer. He was going to go through difficulties as that message was to be carried forth. And as he is describing all of these events, then he is before Bernice and Herod Agrippa and Festus. And as they're listening, the last few verses of chapter 26, Festus, first of all, says, you're mad, you're crazy, you're a maniac. You're talking nonsense, Paul. Paul says, no, no, no. I'm talking something that's very, very straightforward. This is the resurrection. Agrippa, as he listens and talks a little bit, he says to Paul, you think you're going to make me a Christian that quickly? Again, looking at the reticence of those who were Jewish to believe that maybe the deeper promise of God to save and redeem all human beings was really there when most of the Jewish people talked simply in terms of obeying the laws and customs of the people. But Paul says, I don't care if it take a short bit of time or a long bit of time. I need to do everything I can to bring everyone this good news. The conclusion was made then and there that if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, he could have been free. So what do we have here with these speeches? We have a presentation now to particularly in the main political leaders. The religious leaders, of course, are going to have their own agenda. Political leaders mainly have the job of saying, how can we make sure that someone doesn't start a revolt? The fact that Paul didn't seem to be causing any major ruckus and just simply talking about these things to people on his own, they said that's not really that much of an issue. So they would have freed him. But because of this appeal, now he is to be sent and be taken to the city of Rome. So as we come to the conclusion here, we see the way in which Paul has argued and set forth his defense. He talks about having met Jesus. He talks about the resurrection of the dead, and thus in the nature of the church. If the church is known for talking about the death and resurrection of Christ, it will be on target. If it gets into a lot of the other issues, they may indeed not cause such a riot, but they will also get away from what salvation is really all about. And so we can use Paul as a model here. He's not trying to make peace. He's simply trying to give witness, as the Lord called him to do, to the resurrection, which Paul, by virtue of seeing Jesus at Damascus, would have also witnessed that Jesus was raised, and that that message was so powerful that nothing could stop it. Thank you as you continue your study. We'll only have two short lessons left, one where Paul takes his journey by sea to get to Rome, and then the events that take place in Rome as the story comes to a conclusion. Thank you very much for your studying with me.